Today is February the 8th, 2012. My name is Dr. Michael Berna, and I'm here today on behalf of the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, a project that captures and archives the oral histories of the men and women who served in one or more of our nation's conflicts. We're in Monessen, Pennsylvania, at the Monessen Heritage Museum today to interview Father Fred Pfeil, a veteran of the United States Navy. Welcome, Father Pfeil, and thank you for agreeing to share your military experiences with the rest of the nation.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Father Pfeil, let's start with some background information, beginning with when and where you were born.
All right. I was born in Bradenton, Florida, which is near Tampa, July 27th, 1954. I only stayed in Florida the first year of my life, and then my folks moved back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where both my mother and father are originally from, and I spent the rest of my childhood there.
And brothers, sisters?
I'm the oldest of five. I have three younger brothers, and the youngest is a sister.
Oh, excellent. And then you, were you in Wisconsin? You went to high school in Wisconsin?
I did. In fact, a fairly unique experience, as I've come to learn over the years as far as that goes. We lived out in the country, and I went to a typical, stereotypical three-room schoolhouse for my elementary school. First, second, third grade were in one room, fourth and fifth, and sixth, seventh, and eighth were in the other room. And then off to high school, Arrowhead High School, I graduated from in 1972. Then I decided to go to college out of state, so I chose to go to Penn State, where I earned a 4-year bachelor's degree in meteorology.
Ah, meteorology.
Yes. And when I finished my education with my bachelor's degree, I did the typical thing young college grads do. I started looking for a job and realized at that time it was, that would have been 1976 I graduated. The economy was in a similar shape to what it's in now at that time, and there were not many jobs for meteorologists. So I applied to the military, thinking that, well, the Air Force flew planes, the Navy had planes and ships, and they'd need to know what the weather was. And I thought maybe the Army too. So I applied to I went and talked to all three recruiters, applied to all the recruiters, and ended up choosing the Navy program for two reasons. One pretty good reason, one very silly reason. The Navy agreed, they had their officer training program up in Newport, Rhode Island, which I thought sounded wonderful. And their program was, I think at the time, was 3 weeks shorter than the Air Force's indoctrination program, so I decided to go to the Navy.
Well, that's not such a silly reason. Actually, that's a very practical reason. So it was the economics that drove you. You didn't have a patriotic background or some history of family in the military?
Well, as it turns out, I do, but it wasn't really a player in my decision-making process. My dad served briefly in the Navy also, in Korea. But again, and I think his brother, my uncle, did as well. And my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, was in the Army for many years. In fact, most of his career was associated both on active duty and then as a civilian when he got out of active duty with Navy work. And I forget exactly what it was, but he spent a lot of time overseas. So there was that in the background. But really, it was probably more economics than anything that drove me into the military at the time.
Okay. And so you left Wisconsin after you signed up, and you went how and where?
Okay, let's see. So I spent the summer after graduating from college at home, and then when it was time to start my officer candidate school program in Newport, Rhode Island, I drove myself out there, began in August, and I graduated in December. And my first duty station, I was sent to Monterey, California, of all places. And so as a brand new officer in the Navy, I went to work at the, what do they call it? The Fleet Numerical Oceanography Center in Monterey, California. And as we'll probably talk about more later, I actually had several tours of duty there. That facility is the Navy's premier weather forecasting facility in the sense that it is where all the numerical models are run, and the large computer facility is located that runs the numerical models, very similar to what the National Weather Service does for the rest of us when we tune into the National Weather, the Weather Channel and so forth. The Navy has its own programs that it runs for worldwide weather, and that's all generated there in Monterey, California. So I went there as a brand new junior officer. So my position was to work as a watch officer on the computer floor, and I managed a group of primarily enlisted people, and our job was to make sure those models kept running on schedule and were putting out their finished products on schedule that were then sent throughout the world and to the fleet to provide them their weather forecasts.
And the finished products were?
Of that facility, the finished products are simply the output of a numerical model. Now what that means is usually it's just a bunch of numbers in essence of all different parameters of the atmosphere. Typical things like, expected high temperature, low temperature, but it was much more complicated than that. We would forecast the seas on the different oceans of the world. So, looking at whether there was a storm involved or whatever, we would follow waves. And then we talked about both wind-driven waves and what are called swell, which are the longer-term waves that are actually generated in another part of the ocean that traverse the whole body of water. So we did things like that. We would forecast both for the ships at sea that were actually on the surface, and we'd forecast for the aircraft that would fly off the aircraft carriers, wherever they happened to be. So we kind of looked at the whole water column, or the whole column, if you will, from the bottom of the ocean, because we did some things for submarines as well, all the way up to the top of the atmosphere for the pilots.
Mm-hmm. And when you first entered into the Navy then, and it may be either in your training school or when you got to Monterey, were you given the background of all of the Institute and how all these models came about, and from the early days of from Mr. Maury?
No. Actually, that came later. One of the things that happens to most oceanographers, and we call ourselves oceanographers in the Navy. I should take a minute, if I may, just to explain this. My specialty field was an oceanographer. But in the Navy, that encompasses three major disciplines. It encompasses oceanography, also meteorology, and then something that was called at the time mapping, charting, and geodesy. So we studied both the weather of the ocean, if you will, what goes on in the water, and then the bottom of the oceans, the topography of it, how it changes, and what causes changes. And then we be responsible for the actual navigational charts that ships and submarines would use while they were at sea. Mm-hmm. So there were those three disciplines. Well, I only knew about meteorology because that's what my degree was when I graduated from Penn State, and that's the only area that I had any skill in at all when I went off to Monterey. And it wasn't until later in my career that the Navy sent me back to school to earn a master's degree, and that was the discipline of, they called it at the time, air-ocean science. It's actually similar to what you might call a dual degree nowadays if you went off to college and got a dual master's degree in two programs. And that's where I picked up my oceanography and my mapping and charting and geodesy information.
Okay, well, let's go back to your first stop here at Monterey then. So how long were you there, and what were your duties? You said that you had managed a group of people that were responsible for putting out this data.
Right.
But can you tell us a little more what it was like being there at Monterey, and what this first entree into military life was like for you?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I was single at the time, and so Monterey is a wonderful place. I think most of us are aware of that, but I can certainly assure you that it's a wonderful place to be. Beautiful countryside, excellent weather, and the facility itself was very modern. It was located right near the airport. That's not a secret at all. And the schedule we worked was what was unique and somewhat difficult to get used to. I said I was on a watch schedule. People think of that, it's somewhat like shift work, if you will, in the civilian world. But our shifts were 12-hour shifts. We worked from 6:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. or vice versa. And the way we did it in the Navy at that time was every 2 days we'd switch to the other schedule. So we'd work from 2 daytime shifts, 6:30 in the morning to 6:30 at night. Then we'd have a period of time of 48 hours off. And then we'd switch to the nighttime shift, work from 6:30 at night until 6:30 in the morning. Do that for 2 days, then we'd have 72 hours off. And then we'd go back. And we'd keep flip-flopping like that, ad nauseum, really. It was difficult to get used to that. You never got used to, you'd be awake all night for a couple days, and then you'd have to get your body used to sleeping again during the daytime, and then do it the other way around. It was difficult. That part was difficult to get used to. Mm-hmm. My crew was, it was a large facility, and we, I don't, to be honest with you, I don't remember exactly, but I think it varied between like 6 and 8 people would be on the watch team that I supervised. What we would do, well, we were in these large rooms filled with computers, and at the time, everything we did had to be backed up on large reels of magnetic tape. So we spent a lot of time actually hanging tapes on tape drives and, recording all the information that these models had run. We had the typical, computer screens, CRTs. Back then, they were the old, green and yellow kind of screens that we all remember. Nobody uses anymore. But at the time, that's what we had, with the console in front of you. And so I'd have some people actually making sure that the different parts of the computer programs would begin operating when they were supposed to. Mm-hmm. And that was always triggered. This seems obvious to me, but I should probably say it out. It depended on us getting in the observational data. I'm sure we all are aware there's weather stations throughout the country, in fact throughout the world, and they take all those basic measurements. You see them sitting around the sides of highways sometimes. There's a little weather vane with an anemometer on top, and it's got a thermometer inside recording temperature, and another instrument that records humidity, and all that basic information that's being collected at those sites all around the world, all were collected and sent to Monterey. When we had some minimum amount of raw data, that's when it would trigger us starting the next cycle of the computer models to run, to take that raw data and begin to forecast into the future using the numerical models. And so we had men and women sitting at these computers waiting for that data to arrive, and when it did, we'd start. And back then, things weren't as automated as they are now, and so you actually had individual programs that a human being had to start by typing something on a computer. Nowadays, all those things are chain-linked, and they kick each other off almost automatically based on when one finishes, the next one will begin. But back then, it was all done by people. Mm-hmm. And so that's how our routine would go. We would just do that over and over again.
Who on the ships would be responsible for receiving this information, and then how would it be used?
Depends on the size of the ship. Small ships would actually have their forecasts written for them by someone like myself, another oceanographer, stationed somewhere closer to where they were actually operating. So let me back up and explain a little bit how the whole oceanography program in the Navy works. So there was this large facility in Monterey that ran all these models. That output, that raw data of the forecast, would be sent to various locations around the world. I went to one of them as my second duty station. We'll probably talk about that. In Guam. So for instance, information from Monterey would be sent to Guam. The men and women on Guam then would see, out in the western Pacific Ocean, we have the following U.S. Navy ships. The aircraft carriers would have their own weather officer actually on board as part of the crew. But the small ships, like frigates or cruisers, they wouldn't. And so we would write the forecast for those ships based on where they were and where they were going in Guam. And we'd simply write it out in text format and then send a naval message from Guam to the ship. And the radio man on the ship would receive the weather forecast as one of the pieces of traffic, they called it, the message, and he would give it to someone up on the bridge who would then use that information to guide them in driving the ship wherever they were headed to.
Okay.
And as I said, then the larger ships, they would receive the information from Guam and directly from Monterey. And so that the weather officer on board an aircraft carrier would then formulate his own forecasts. And that weather officer on the aircraft carrier would write individual forecasts for instance, the pilots that were going to be flying missions off the carrier that day. He would provide on-scene support.
Okay. Okay.
So it was a little different based from the big ships compared to the little ships.
Yeah, quite interesting to know that. We would think that they would all be similar forecasts, but
Yeah, no,
how they're interpreted are quite different.
Yes.
So you were in Monterey for how long then?
A little over 2 years.
Okay.
And then off to Guam I went, where I actually continued to do the same thing on the same schedule. I was a watch officer. We worked 12-hour shifts, 6:30 to 6:30, same rotation. The difference there was, as I alluded to, we were actually following ships in our area of expertise, the area that we were supposed to be responsible for. And on Guam, it happened to be the Western Pacific from the date line all the way over to China, and the Indian Ocean, all of the Indian Ocean. And the Southern Hemisphere as well in that area. So, for instance, if we had ships in the Western Pacific, obviously, and in Indian Ocean, but the Indian Ocean crosses the equator, and if we had ships traversing down to, for instance, Australia or New Zealand, we would be writing their forecasts as well. Guam was a unique place in that there was a Navy base there with a large harbor that ships would come to port in. There's also on the other end of the island, or not the other end, but on the northern end of the island of Guam, there's an Air Force base. The Air Force base was somewhat independent. They had their own Air Force weather people on board, but there was a command, ComNav Marianas, Commander Naval Forces Marianas, who also integrated closely with what the Air Force was doing, and we also helped provide weather support for the local island and all the civilians and military people who actually lived on the island of Guam. You might not think about this, but actually, if you're at all familiar with how typhoons and hurricanes work, Guam is sort of in Typhoon Alley in the Pacific, much like the east coast of the U.S. is a target for any hurricane moving through the Atlantic Ocean. It ends up oftentimes either in the Gulf of Mexico or anywhere from Florida up the East Coast. Guam was right in that same sort of bullseye alley of where storms go in the Pacific. And so oftentimes during the right season, Guam would be under threat from being hit by a typhoon. And it was our job to forecast that and try and get people enough advance warning that we could prevent a lot of property damage as well as personal injury.
Very interesting. And how about during these typhoons, the ships? The ships that were out in those waters, how did they maneuver or counter?
That was one of our primary jobs, to keep the ships out of harm's way. And so, again, when there was a typhoon coming, we tried to get them enough advance notice so they had time, because ships, they don't go that fast. So you had to drive them out of the path of the typhoon. But there was, and that sounds fairly elementary, and it is, but the decision-making process of how to do that was complicated, because ships have missions to perform. And so the idea was how to keep the ship out of harm's way while not impacting too seriously on their mission that they were trying to accomplish. Because if you have to sidetrack a ship for several days and let this storm go past, their window of opportunity to accomplish their mission might be missed. So it was always a juggling act. And oftentimes you're trying to cut the corners and get as close as you could without actually causing damage. And those kinds of trade-offs, if you were always being made.
So your time on Guam, what was Guam like? Was that your first trip into an island area like
Yes,
that?
it was actually my first trip outside the United States, although Guam is a U.S. possession, but it was first time out of the continental United States, if you will. And it was wonderful, I will tell you. Okay, so I didn't mention this, but I actually got married during those 2 years in Monterey.
Okay.
And so my new wife and I jumped on an airplane and headed to Guam, and at that time she was pregnant with our first child. So our first child was born on Guam, and so we had lots of good memories of Guam as a new young family. But even more than that, Guam, more than any place, even more than Hawaii, is an island of perpetual summer. It's just never cold there. I love to tell this story, actually. It's such an even climate on Guam. Every day I was there, and I was on Guam for another 2 years, almost exactly, month to month. For the 2 years I was on Guam, the high temperature for the day never varied more than between 89 degrees or 93. 89 and 93 every single day for 2 years. The coldest temperature it ever got in the whole 2 years I was there at night, the coldest it ever got was 73. So it was a very even and very warm climate. Also very humid. Very humid. Even more, people talk about how humid Florida is, and that's true, but Guam was always that humid or more. So you just got very used to this totally tropical weather all the time. Mm-hmm. The only difference was the wind. There was a season where the trade winds blew, and so there was always a nice breeze. And then there was a season when the trade winds would just stop, and it was sultry. Mm. But other than that, it was... And another interesting thing about Guam is, because of the shape of the island, which is essentially, it's a volcano. It's a volcano that sticks up out of the surface of the water. Okay. That island, again, depending on season, but almost every day, you could count on a rain shower somewhere in the afternoon, like between 4 and 6 in the afternoon. It would rain. And it would rain for maybe a half an hour and quit, and the sun would come back out. Mm-hmm. So it would go from being humid to even more humid. So, but and we just have great memories because there was, in that kind of weather, you can be outside all the time, mm-hmm. As long as you can get used to that humidity and the heat. And we were young, and we went outside all the time. We would take hikes. The phrase would be booney stomps. You'd go out into the boonies, out into the jungles, if you will, and there were paths. And Guam was one of the islands hotly contested in the Second World War, and there was a lot of old derelict things you could find out there. Old tanks, old buildings that were just falling apart and into disrepair. And people had just left them out there, and you'd stumble across them as you were out hiking around in the jungles. So that was always fun.
So you lived on base?
There was the Navy base, and there was housing provided on base, yes. And so we didn't even have the option of buying a home out on the economy. That was not an option. Of course, I wasn't making much money then. I couldn't have afforded it anyway. But I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure if we probably weren't even allowed to do that. We probably were required to live in the provided housing.
And this would have been what year?
1980 to 1982. Okay. I was on Guam.
Okay, so there wasn't really any military conflict going on.
No.
At that point in time.
No, there was not.
Okay.
I came in as obviously just after Vietnam had winded down, mm-hmm. And the next conflict that occurred, really of any significance, was Grenada. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, I was in a duty station that was remote from that, and so I was not the guy on scene, even for that affair. Most of my support was always to the fellas who actually were on any of these little skirmishes. There's always a skirmish going on. Sometimes they don't make the news, but the little things. I remember one time we had to provide special support to a little flare-up that occurred in Panama. So things go on all the time that don't always make the news, but there's issues that go on. But I was never actually one sent there. I retired as Desert Storm was happening. And again, I was providing support to the guys who actually were going ashore with the Marines over there. But I was not there myself.
But that support would have been in terms of what, the tides or?
All kinds of things. Everything from sunrise, sunset, moonrise, moonset, cloud cover, to the actual chance of sandstorms, as well as the typical, highs and lows and whether it's going to rain or not. Mm-hmm. As you recall, specifically during Desert Storm, remember, one of the things that happened was a lot of the oil fields were burning, and there was a lot of black smoke, and we tried to forecast where those smoke clouds were going to go, because that impacted all kinds of things. Visibility, sure, but also how other equipment could operate or maybe not be able to operate. So we provided that kind of support too.
How successful were you with your forecasts?
Oh, that's always an ongoing joke, I like to tell people that I love my job because it's the only job I can think of where we continue to get paid our salary even when we were wrong. But it's, we have a system in all weather forecasting. I don't care if you're in the Navy, the Air Force, or working for the National Weather Service, where we try and statistically analyze how well we do with our forecasts, but that's not something that makes a lot of sense to the typical Joe, because it's all statistics, and statistics is a very specific mathematical field, and it's not always intuitive. So, for instance, when we say that there's a 70% chance of rain, well, that could be interpreted lots of different ways, but there were very specific guidelines. So, to try and answer your question, how well did we do? We would say, and I believe, we actually did quite well. Mm-hmm. We did well enough that the Navy thought we were of value, and the ships and pilots relied on us. And there were occasions where, we were the deciding factor. I can remember times when I would be briefing an admiral on a projected mission, and if I briefed him that I didn't think the weather was going to be conducive to accomplishing the mission and it would negatively impact, he would reschedule. He'd scrub the mission and say, we're going to do this another day. So, and he wouldn't have said that if he didn't trust me, if he didn't believe that I knew what I was talking about. You oftentimes did develop personal relationships and your reputation as to, could you be trusted? Were you usually right or not? Mm-hmm. And so, I felt in most cases that I was trusted enough that people did listen to what I had to say. I wasn't just discounted. And there were other guys I knew, though, where that did happen. They weren't always right, or weren't right enough. Mm-hmm. But fortunately for me, in my career in the Navy, most of the time, I think I did do a relatively good job.
Well, I find that an interesting point, because we have all looked back in history and we've seen debacles because of the weather.
Yes.
And I don't think people understand or recognize or realize what you just mentioned there, the relationship, the trust factor that goes in between the decision to go or the decision not to go.
Right.
And so it's kind of funny how it comes on, or maybe not funny, but it's telling that it comes down to these personal relationships and this real trust in people that you have. And obviously that didn't always happen, or occasionally it may have gone awry for some unknown reason.
Right.
But what we don't see, just as you say, we don't often see the skirmishes, we don't often see all of that that's taking place that keeps all of those debacles from happening.
That's right. And let's be honest, when you do hear about, just recently I'm thinking of when the decision was made by our president to go and send that team of Marines to get Osama bin Laden. It was never discussed, but I know from my experience, one of the people that was consulted before the president made his final decision was one of us weather guys. They had to know when they went to that compound if they were going to be able to land the helicopters, even get them there, and to get the people out safely, what the nighttime weather was going to be. Was it going to be a full moon, no moon, what kind of lighting was going to be available? All that kind of information came from the weather guys. And we are not the only ones, obviously. They consulted all kinds of different experts on all parts of that mission. But one of them was us, the weather guys. But that's never mentioned. That didn't make the news either, but I know it was part of the decision-making process.
Well, that's why it's so important, your story today, that you're telling us this and sharing it, because I would say probably 99% of the people never do hear that or really recognize that or understand that. So while you were on Guam, did your rank change at all?
Oh, yes. I forget to tell that part of the story. So when I joined the Navy and was commissioned, I was an ensign. That's an 01. And on Guam, I made 02, which is lieutenant junior grade. And while there, I also made 03, lieutenant. So yes, I left Guam as a lieutenant, a full lieutenant in the Navy. I'm trying to think. It's terrible, but I forget the progression of my duty stations. From Guam, I went back to the United States, and I think my next duty station was in the Washington, D.C. area. We weather guys have a funny way of doing business in the Washington, D.C. area. There are several different commands that we get assigned to. And for various reasons, we may or may not actually be working at the place we're assigned to. This was one of those occasions for me. I was assigned to what was called at the time the Naval Polar Oceanography Center in a suburb called Suitland, Maryland. And I reported there the first day to report on my set of orders and get them stamped that I had reported for duty. And I never went back there until the day I left the command 2 years later. And I spent most of my time, well, virtually all of my time, in the Pentagon, working in the Pentagon. And I was assigned as what was called the Junior Officer Detailer. Now, the different services have different names for the job I was doing, but I was the guy who was writing orders, reassigning people at the lower pay grades. Mm-hmm. So I would take, like me, I took people from Monterey and I'd send them to Guam or wherever we needed them. And it was always a shell game, trying to fill holes. And people were moving because their tour was over, or they had a family emergency they had to deal with, or there was another problem somewhere else, and I needed that person to go fix that problem, and then I had to fill behind him. It's always that kind of a thing that we were doing as detailers. Mm-hmm. In the military, you serve at the pleasure of the president, which in practical terms means you don't have the final say on where you work. But there is a system where we tried real hard to match up where people would like to go with where we actually ended up sending them based on needs of the service. And we tried really hard, too, to understand that there was a progression which was conducive to being promoted to higher and higher ranks, and there were other career paths, as we call them, that were not very conducive to getting promoted at all. So we tried to make everybody have equal chance to get their promotions on time. Because, as you may or may not know, in the military we have this up-or-out system. You either continue to get promoted, or if you don't, you're asked to leave the service. And at the officer ranks anyway, I'm talking about now, not so much the enlisted, but at the officer ranks that's especially true. And so you tried to keep people's careers, if you will, viable, so that they could be promoted on time and on schedule. Mm-hmm. Because if you didn't get promoted, you were sent home. And so that was part of our detailing job too, to make sure that where we were sending people was actually going to help them and not hurt them in their promotion potential. Mm-hmm. So all those things we tried to mesh it all together and make it work as best we could.
A little different than meteorology.
Right. In fact, and so I was no longer writing forecasts at all at that point, and I was more in the business of personnel management. But I did it only for the weather guys. I wasn't doing it for just any general officer in the Navy. It was only for the weather officers because, again, our duty stations were very limited and our career path was unique. And so I had a knowledge, and I had another more senior officer working with me who had even more experience and knowledge to help us make sure that we were helping and not hurting people without thinking, unintended.
Right.
So,
and you said your stay in D.C. was for 2 years.
2 years I did that.
And then?
And by then I had another child, just on the personal note.
Sure.
My son was born at the Army Hospital at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, which is another suburb right outside D.C. So then what did I do? I think I stayed there. I stayed in the D.C. area, but moved from that job to a job in this command has changed names. It's not called this anymore. I don't even know its correct name anymore. But at the time it was called the Defense Mapping Agency Hydrographic Topographic Center. Fairly big mouthful. But it was a joint command where all the special charts and maps that the military would use for any mission around the world were actually built from scratch. And that was in Bethesda, Maryland, a northern suburb of D.C. So I continued to live where I was, my family and I, but I just started going to a different place to work every day. And that was my first real chance to work on that mapping, charting, geodesy part of that career path I told you, the 3 disciplines. Sure. This is my first exposure to that discipline. And it was actually kind of backwards, because I later had a tour at sea where we were collecting the raw data to build the charts that we were actually building at the Defense Mapping Agency. So I saw the building part of it first, and then I got to go out and actually collect the data later. While in Bethesda, I worked specifically in the area that built the charts for the Navy. It was all the nautical stuff. Not so much land maps, but at sea maps, maps of the ocean floor, navigational maps so that ships would not run aground, that kind of thing. The place was huge. There were thousands of people working there, mostly civilian, and then there were a few of us military who either, well, in my case, my direct supervisor was another military officer, but our boss, our senior boss for the nautical charting part of that command was a civilian, and I worked with many, many civilians who were helping us build these nautical charts.
What did you find most interesting about this? Now, this is a new kind of ground for you,
yes,
so to speak.
Well, the thing that was most fascinating for me was to see how we took all this raw information and had the tools at our hand, and somewhat of the drawing maps is a little bit of an art. Much of it's computerized, but I was surprised to see some of it was still actually hand drawn. So that was fascinating to watch the men and women who had these skills. And it wasn't me. I could barely draw a stick figure, but these people were really skilled at what they did. And to see then, where did the raw data come from? How was it collected? What were the different sources? Because obviously there's some parts of the world where we weren't allowed to go in and figure, you're not allowed to take a ship to try and map the bottom of the floor of the ocean floor right into some port in the Soviet Union back then. It just wasn't allowed, or China for that matter, even to this day. And so we used all kinds of sources to try and figure this out. Maybe a friendly country would share what information they had with us. Or sometimes, there are amazing techniques that have been developed to use instruments in either aircraft or actually even up on a satellite, where you can infer what the depth of the water might be. So there was that kind of information, and you take all this raw data then, right? Some of it is very reliable because you've done something very specific, like taken a sonar and driven over the bottom of the ocean and very precisely pinged what the depth is. Then there's some of these other sources, like from an airplane or a satellite, where you don't have as much confidence that it's exactly right. It might be right plus or minus some feet.
Right.
Maybe plus or minus 2 feet, maybe plus or minus 100 feet. We don't know. So you had to weight your raw information differently based on how reliable you figured it was. That whole process of taking this raw data, deciding what's more trustworthy than others, meshing it all together, and then finally coming up with your final product, a piece of paper or digital map for that matter, that you can hand to a ship and say, use this to navigate. The whole process was fascinating.
Well, that is fascinating. When you look all the way back into historic times and you look at that idea of map making, and we look now back then and we say, well, it's so much better now than it was then. And I'm sure 50 years from now we'll look back to this time and say it's so much better now than.
Yes.
But as you say, it truly is an art, and it does require a lot of people with a lot of different skills to put these kinds of things together. And,
very true.
And as you say, it was kind of backwards. So let's move to the period then, your time on the ship, the name of the ship, and how you got there, and about your time while you were on there and how long you were there.
Sure. I was on the USNS Chauvenet. And by that introductory title there, USNS, for those who know the Navy, that's a clue, if you will, to the fact that the ship was not a typical warfighting ship. It wasn't a USS ship, it was a USNS ship. And that designation implies that it wasn't a warship. It was actually a military Sea Lift Command ship, which is unique in several respects. And our ship was unique for even more reasons. The military Sea Lift Command are ships that have civilian crews on them, but are specifically working for the United States Navy. an obvious, or maybe not so obvious, reason that I can talk about is that ships sometimes are forward deployed with supplies. Basic things like, extra paper and batteries and anything that you might need to have people on a ship be able to live somewhat comfortable lives. Those supply ships are forward deployed and they sit around out in the middle of the ocean waiting for a Navy ship, a warship, to come by and pick up some supplies. But our ship was unique in another way. Our ships were specifically designed and built to do this mapping and charting function. And so they had built into the hulls very unique sonar equipment. We had on board, yes, a civilian crew, but also a military detachment would ride the ship, and whose job was to collect the data. So you had to have this very close working relationship between the master and his mates, who were actually on the bridge physically driving the ship, and the engineers down the engineers who were making sure the engines were actually running, and then my military people who were telling the guys on the bridge, this is where we need to go, because this is the part of the ocean we're trying to map. Now, you may not think much about this, but depending on how the bottom is shaped determines how often you need to collect a data point on what the depth is, for instance. If it's a very flat bottom, you don't need to worry about it so much, and you can, take a measurement every so often. But if the bottom is changing very rapidly, you need to take a lot more data points, a lot more rapidly, to define very clearly what those humps and valleys are. And so that was my job. That was the Navy guy's job, to tell the ship, okay, this is where you can go pretty fast because we don't need to take so many data points, or here you need to slow down because we got to take lots and lots of measurements as we're driving along. And it also determined how, we would call it mowing the grass. You'd go back and forth on the water and precisely navigating where you were. I mean, you think about it, you're out in the middle of the ocean, how are you going to know? Did I move over the length of the ship? Or did I move over 2 lengths of the ship? How do you know? Well, we know essentially by GPS. The same systems we use with our little GPS systems in our car also helps ships navigate at sea. And so we would go back and forth on these very specifically defined lines. And as you can guess, waves push the ship around, wind pushes the ship around. So it was the job of the master and the mates on the bridge, talking constantly to the people, my Navy guys, who were saying, look, you're straying offline a little bit, you got to go a little bit left, you got to go a little bit right. It was a constant communications to keep us on that imaginary line, if you will, on the surface of the ocean, so the ship didn't get pushed off that line. We needed to be right on that line, collecting our data. Turn around, move over a little, come back and forth, and that's what we did. There were other times when we were actually in proximity, usually of islands, or sometimes the shore of some larger land mass, but whenever we were in shallow water, we had 4 small boats. We call them hydrographic survey launches, HSL for short. They were boats that were up on the deck of the ship that we could put over the side, and those small boats, because they had a much shallower draft, could go right up to the beach almost, in very shallow water where the ship couldn't go. And they had sonars on them as well. And so these little boats would have a 2-man crew on them, one guy driving, one guy making sure the equipment was working properly, and they would do the same thing, driving lines back and forth in close to shore where the ship couldn't get. So that essentially we could have information right up to water that was shallow enough for a guy to jump over the side and go ashore. And that's the kind of data we were doing on my sea tour. Okay. And the next question you can ask me is, where did you do this? Yes. And so I'll answer that. We started out in the Indian Ocean. No, excuse me, that's wrong. We ended in the Indian Ocean. We started out in Indonesia. In the it's kind of a convoluted area there. There's islands everywhere. When you look at a map, you don't get a good feel for just how many islands make up the country of Indonesia. Those are the bigger ones. But in between all those bigger ones, there's lots of islands the size of this room. And so we were constantly navigating and mapping all the water areas between all these islands. And the amazing thing that I found amazing, and one of the more exciting things, was every one of those islands had people living on them. Every one of those islands.
No matter the size.
No, there were some islands so small they might have literally, like you see in a cartoon, there might have been 1 or 2 palm trees, but there was also a house on that island and a little dugout canoe pulled up on the beach, and there was a family living there. So we spent 6 months in an area called the Flores Sea, doing that, in and out and amongst all these islands. The second 6 months, and I was at sea for essentially 14 months total. First half in Indonesia. The second half, we moved the ship over to the Indian Ocean, and specifically right on the Horn of Africa. If you think of Africa, there's that area where Ethiopia and Somalia come down, and it comes up to a little point.
Right.
We surveyed right on that point, and around it, right around that Horn of Africa. And one of the things I'll always remember is that right on that point, and it really is a point. You know, you think, well, on a map it looks like a point, but if you're there, it's probably kind of rounded and not so pointy. But this was pretty much a point. There was a huge cliff. And on the top of that cliff was an old abandoned lighthouse. And we went ashore and climbed up to where that lighthouse was on the top of this cliff. And the reason is we had to put a precisely located navigation point there that the GPS system could then use in conjunction with the radar on the ship to precisely locate where we were actually driving our lines in that part of the world. Mm-hmm. So that was exciting. That was exciting to go there.
Yeah, and what kind of depths are we talking about in that particular area?
Surprisingly, well, maybe not so surprisingly, that area is actually fairly flat-bottomed, if you will. It gently slopes from the shore out to the deeper water. There weren't too many surprises. As you might guess, over in Indonesia that wasn't so because it was so volcanic there. Mm-hmm. There were lots of peaks and valleys, very bumpy bottom. But off that Horn of Somalia, it was pretty much gentle. Mm-hmm. One of the really exciting things that happened to us one day, though, is, you know, we hear about ocean currents. And most of the time you can't actually physically see a current, but they're there. And you can see them with special instrumentation, like from a satellite. You can see where the Gulf Stream is when you falsely color the water and you closely measure temperature. Usually its surface temperature is a reflection of where the currents are. And so when you make an image of the temperature of the water, you can see the currents. But to the naked eye, you can't tell there's a current out off the coast of Virginia or South Carolina. In this instance, where we were, you could see it on the water. And it was because the currents were flowing fast enough that debris that was floating on the water, you know, leaves or just junk, human waste, you know, plastic bottles, there was a line of this junk on the water where the two currents met and you know, collided, if you will. And you could actually see this line, and it stretched off into the distance.
Incredible.
And that was very interesting.
Yeah, so even the weathermen can be surprised by some
Oh, absolutely. Of course, we were always surprised by neat things like we'd see flying fish some days. There would be porpoises swimming alongside the ship different days. Yeah. Sometimes, not so often, but once in a while you'd see a whale surface off the side of the ship somewhere.
Right.
There was always that going on. That was fun.
Right. And then when you got back off the ship now, how much longer? You were in the service for a total of how long?
25 years.
Okay.
25 years.
Okay. So, and you were progressing still upward,
up the
obviously.
rank, yes, I was getting promoted along. I don't remember exactly. I'm trying to think. Okay, so I went to the ship. After I got off the ship, I went back to Monterey. This time I was at the Naval Postgraduate School. This is where I got my higher degree, my master's level degree with the dual emphases. Mm-hmm. The Navy, in its great good fortune and wisdom, put their advanced training school for all naval services in Monterey at this Naval Postgraduate School. And it's a beautiful campus right next to the ocean. And so that my second time I got to live in Monterey, California, and that again that was a 2.5-year program to earn that master's degree.
Okay.
And so that was that's another good deal that the military has for its people. It will send you to school, continue to pay you your salary, and pay your tuition.
Mm-hmm.
So and then I earned my master's degree there. And when I graduated from the school, I was by then an 04, a lieutenant commander. Where did I go? I think, my next duty station was at Omaha, Nebraska, of all places. I went to work at another joint command, and I was at an Air Force base. Offutt Air Force Base is outside of Omaha, Nebraska. And in one of its, shuffling, if you will, of duties that the military does every once in a while, they created a new command called the United States Strategic Command. They took the old Air Force SAC, Strategic Air Command, which was all the bombers, long-range bombers, and combined all nuclear support at that base in Offutt Air Force Base. So now, not just the long-range bombers of the Air Force that could deliver nuclear weapons and others, but also the control of the missile silos that time were still very active all around the borders of our country, and the Navy's ballistic missile submarines, which could also launch nuclear weapons. So all the control of nuclear weapons of any kind were consolidated at this new command called the United States Strategic Command in Omaha, Nebraska. I went there as the first weather officer to support that command. So I was working with my counterparts in the Air Force. It was joint. So there were Air Force weather people, officer and enlisted, working with Navy weather people, officer enlisted, and we worked together to provide all this weather support for all these different platforms wherever they were in the world. And we did it all from Offutt Air Force Base.
Well, when you talk about the nuclear power and the strategy, no wonder you had so many people working.
Yes,
in
there were a
such an
lot.
important place.
There were a lot of people. And again, because essentially, at that point, you have to be able to predict the weather anywhere in the world. Bombers can reach wherever they can go. Those nuclear missile silos, they're aimed at specific targets, but they again have very long reach. And so then we were concerned, of course, in our planning scenarios. We were wargaming. You hear that time and time again. We would play war games. They were what-if drills, if you will. If we have to attack this location in the next 72 hours, what's the weather going to be like and what will happen? If we actually detonate a bomb, where will that radioactive debris go? That was primarily the kind of job that we were performing at STRATCOM. We had to be very careful that, there weren't unintended consequences from fallout going somewhere that might actually hurt us more than the bad guy,
right,
whoever that was. So we were always doing those kinds of drills.
Right. And you had one more promotion before you left.
I did. I made full commander, 05, and that promotion came where? I can't remember.
That's all right.
I've been bounced back and forth. Oh, I do remember now. So from excuse me, from that command at Offutt Air Force Base, and again, I was there about 2 years. Most of my tours were all about 2 years long. I was sent back to Monterey, California, back to the Fleet Numerical Oceanography Command, the place where I started as an ensign. I went back to that numerical modeling command. This time I made commander shortly after I got there. And I was a department head at that time, which means I was not the commanding officer, I was the officer in charge of one of the major departments in that command where we were running these numerical models again. Job hadn't changed, it's just that my position within the command had changed. And while there for a short period of time, I was actually promoted to the executive officer, which is the second in command. I worked directly under the commanding officer. And that was primarily, an administrative job. I had lots of people working for me, but my job was spent pretty much staying in the office. I would go out and mix, because I'm a people person. I'd go out and rub shoulders with folks, but my job was essentially administrative. And then from there, I went back to Washington, D.C., and I worked at the Office of Naval Research. That is the I don't know if there's any equivalent. There are other commands in the other services that do similar things. Let me just boil it down in a nutshell if I can. I'm going to oversimplify. Anybody who ever watches this and is familiar with these commands knows how grossly I'm oversimplifying. But the Office of Naval Research is responsible for funding research at major institutions around the country to do things that the Navy's interested in. Mm-hmm. And so obviously for me, my job there was to help that command pick out primarily educational institutions, usually universities, not always, but usually, to do research on oceanographers' things. While I was there, I can tell you we worked on things like how can you better predict things like visibility in the water, so that if you put a diver down in the water to perform a mission, he needs to know if the water is going to be clear or murky. And if it's too murky, you need to scrub the mission and don't even put the guy in danger. So we funded that kind of research. How can you predict it? How can you measure it? And is there in fact any way to influence it? Another thing that happens is something called bioluminescence. Some critters, animals in the water, give off light if they're excited a certain way. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. If you're trying to stay hidden, it's bad if you run through a school of something that all of a sudden puts off a lot of light, and then all of a sudden you thought you were going to be in the dark and you suddenly are lit up and visible. On the other hand, you can use that to advantage too sometimes. We funded research to try and figure out where is this luminescence, how does it work, can man influence it? So that, all these kinds of somewhat more esoteric things, looking for future development of something that we might be able to use, was what the Office of Naval Research did. It does it for all different kinds of areas throughout what the Navy's interested in. Everything from weapons systems to medical issues to the weather. My little area of expertise was just worrying about funding for the weather stuff. But ONR does much, much more than that. And that's the command that I retired from.
Okay. Well, Father Pfeil, I must say, you've enlightened us about a lot of things, as it sounds like you were enlightened in your career along the way.
Yes, I learned a lot.
First came from Penn State Meteorologist School to where you ended up and looking at kind of full circle now, going back to the university setting again and trying to find some research that would be applicable for future use. It's been a most fascinating career that you've had. And as we close, what would you like to say? Anything that you would like to add in closing?
I can say with no reservation that I'm very proud of what I did in the Navy. I'm proud of having served my country. And in a funny kind of way, I've been asked many times, how did you go from being a naval officer to someone working as a clergyman, as a priest in a church? And at first blush, it does seem very disparate, but I think it's not so much if you dig into it. I was working with people, for people, trying to help people in the Navy, and I think I do the same now. So certainly in that aspect of trying to be helpful to people, granted in very different ways, but in general, being helpful and just being helpful. I think it's a good fit. I also was always involved with faith all through my naval career, so it wasn't quite so disparate as you might think. And I would encourage anyone who has some inkling that they might like to serve in the military to investigate. We tend to think in very sort of black and white terms. If you want to be in the Navy, you got to want to go to sea and be a sailor. If you want to be in the Air Force, you got to want to be a pilot. It's much more in-depth than that, and there's much more opportunity, which is another way of saying there are more specific niches, specialized careers that are available to you if you do a little research. So if you're at all interested in serving the country, in the military in any way, you might be surprised. There might be something that fits you that you wouldn't ordinarily think of. So investigate.
Well, I think that's an excellent closing remark, and someone will take great benefit by that, I'm sure. And on behalf of our country, thank you for the service, and thank you for performing at such a high level the entire time you were in the military, and we appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming here today.
And thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me and making me part of this history. It's been my pleasure.